I presented this topic, I prepared it for today, and we're talking about the board's role in performance assessment, and this image you see is a title page of our book that Vic Murray and I wrote, that you can download for free from the internet. If you type in the title, it should come up. And so a lot of the structure that we're going to talk about will come from there, but there'll be other information. So the agenda really is, we're just focusing on the board's role and responsibilities in performance assessment. And we're going to zero in on whether boards are, well, we're going to talk about that first, have challenges in this area, and what you think, you know, from your own experience, what some of those challenges are. And then we're going to look at the issues that we assess through the board checkup, which is a performance assessment application. And then we'll look at the research, to what extent do boards experience them, and then we'll talk about why these challenges occur and what can be done about them. And I'm going to draw from theory about the role of boards in this area, the concepts, and I'm going to talk about fiduciary governance, good governance practices, and then the research on that around board change. So what are boards actually changing in this area? So there's a lot here, and if we may not get through it all, but maybe we will. And if you would like to ask questions or talk about anything at any time, just speak up and just interrupt me, because I can't really see if you raise your hand. I might be able to. Oh, here comes somebody else coming in. I'm going to admit them. So do feel free to pause and we can reflect. But I do have a lot of content here, just to warn you, because this is a big topic. I'm going to welcome. We have another participant, and I'm just going to see here, it's Troy. Troy is joining us. Troy, we're going to just start here because it's a bit after 11. And if you have any questions, just feel free to raise your hand or just speak up and unmute yourself. So let's get into it. What is performance assessment, and why is performance assessment important? Well, it is part of a board's due diligence function in ensuring that the organization that the board governs is achieving its mission efficiently and effectively. As the body to which the CEO, if this is a professionalized organization, reports, so CEOs report to boards, the board is also responsible, in addition to the organization, for assessing the CEO's performance. And not just limited to the CEOs, nonprofits and all corporations are self-governing. And so boards are responsible for ensuring that those corporations, we're going to let some Daniel in too. Troy, welcome. Daniel, welcome. We're already starting. But boards are responsible for ensuring that they are governing, that the corporation is governed effectively. So there's different levels of analysis here. And boards are both legally and morally accountable to those for whom they act as trustees in this role. And this is really critical, particularly on the not-for-profit side. And they are required by law to account for the organization, and to also those who fund the organization or for which there's legal contracts. There is part of the accountability function always involves performance assessment. So to account for something requires an underlying assessment of gathering of data and an analysis and reporting of that data. And so, for example, showing how donations were used, how funding agreements were followed, how the mission was advanced, and that's to regulators that allow the corporation to exist. So that in Canada, for example, a corporation must follow its mission as stated in its incorporation documents. And it can't really deviate from there, especially for the type of corporation that it has been approved, whether it's a charity. So if it's a charity, it has to fall within its charitable mission, and it can't deviate from that, or it risks losing its charitable status. So boards that fail to do this, to carry out their accountability obligations, really increase the risk of the organization failing, including, as I just mentioned, it ceasing to exist and losing its charitable status. So all of that would depend on the jurisdiction in which that corporation is located. So that's really important. What does the laws say where the organization is located? And if it's located in multiple jurisdictions, all of those laws apply to that corporation. So let's just stop for a moment and pause. From your own experience, and I know you have lots of experiences, do you think boards face challenges in this area in meeting their responsibilities for performance assessment? And if so, where are they challenged? Let's just open it up. So just feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes, Yvonne, I think many boards, in my context, I work with different boards in different countries. The challenge that I see is probably not knowing how they can actually carry out the assessment and continuous evaluation. So as a result, they have a very strong sense of engaging the CEO and the management in terms of keeping them accountable. But it weakens when it comes to the board itself, keeping itself accountable, through going through a detailed assessment on how are they executing their governance responsibilities to the institution. So there is that gap always that is created. Hence many boards keeps on running and have very little aspect of the self-assessment on their role. Especially they may do it well on the CEO and his team, but on assessing their performance as a board, there's always a challenge there.
Excellent. Other you can agree with Farai and add to it, add other pieces, challenges, gaps. Okay, well, of course, I would completely agree with you on that. And there are other issues that challenge boards, or at least that we surface and are assessed through the board checkup. So one of them is not really assessing how well the organization is achieving its mission and how effective that organization is and how efficient it is in doing so. And the board not really getting enough of the right kind of information that it needs in order to evaluate how well the organization is doing. So really, really lacks data. And other issues are really not doing an adequate analysis of risks facing that organization, or getting involved too late after they surface to do anything about them. Not ensuring that finances are managed soundly is another symptom. And then again, not carrying out assessments of the CEO's performance, but also the board's performance too. So that I just didn't include that in there, but it's in the last one where the board simply doesn't even understand that it has a responsibility to assess its own performance and develop itself as a governing body. So these are those issues that we include in the board checkup. So this is based on over 7,000 directors who have assessed their board in this area, and these are the issues that come up. The red. So in the top of the most challenging for at least from the opinions of those who assess their boards, was that the board doesn't do a good job or an adequate job of assessing risks that the organization might face, or assessing how well the organization is achieving its mission. Those were the lowest scores, meaning they're the most likely issues. But then sort of in the middle are about not assessing the performance of the ED and not getting enough data to do that. And the least problematic is around finances. And so I just sort of summarize them. Top two seem to be the most salient. There's some middle ground, and one seems to be less problematic around managing finance. So, you know, why do boards experience these problems? And I think, you know, we talked about it around a lack of knowledge, but yeah, there's a lack of clarity actually, even about the amount and kind of assessments that the board should undertake. And then it could also be that the board and management have different ideas about what the board's role is in this area. The board, maybe management doesn't think that the board should be involved in assessing the organization's effectiveness. So there could be some confusion there, different ideas about roles. And it could be that the management isn't supplying it, or that the systems, the organization really doesn't even collect the data that it needs, doesn't even have access to this data. Or it's in paper format, it's not in a suitable form for the board to access it. Or it could be that there are no real structures created or processes for assessment in the organization. So the board simply lacks that kind of capacity to collect data, but also then once it has it, to actually analyze that data and understand what it means. And then that goes back to your knowledge issue. And then it also could be a culture that's developed in the organization where the board might be uncomfortable monitoring and evaluating the performance of the ED, who they have a close relationship with, who they're dependent on to advance the mission of the organization, and or holding that person accountable for performance for fear that it may show lack of trust or could harm the relationship. I hear that one a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what do we do about this? This is a complex problem, and we know from surfacing are talking with directors, that they're observing these issues as well. So what I wanted to spend some time on, I'm going to talk about, well, what do we do about this? And the book is structured around this. There are practices, things that you can do to improve the board's behavior and practice in this area. But I'm going to add a few things to it before we just get into best practice. I want to go back to some of the theory about the role of boards in this area, why boards exist, what their role is supposed to be from a theoretical point of view, and then talk about the concept of fiduciary governance, which is what this is about. And more and less effective approaches that boards take to it. And I'm going to draw from some of the literature. Some well-known scholars there, different scholars I'm going to draw from. So I'm going to start with that, and then I'm going to sort of move our way through, but I'm going to start with that and then sort of move into, how can you then beef up effectiveness and talk about some of the leadership and the structures that could be implemented, and some tools and resources that exist in addition to assessing the performance using the board checkup. There are other frameworks and tools that are here that I'm going to draw some attention to that you can use. And then I'm going to show you, after I go through this, what the boards who assess performance actually changed in response to assessing their performance. So I'm going to show you the change that occurs through this practice. Let's just get to, okay, in theory, boards act, so principal agent theory, in theory, boards act on behalf of principals to advance their interests. You could say they're on behalf of owners to advance their interests, whoever those owners may be, members, whoever they may be. And that's a good question to ask. Who are the owners? Who are the principals? Are we clear about that? But we act on behalf of principals to advance their interests. And boards delegate some of their authority to agents, to CEOs, to advance, I spelled principal wrong, principal interests. And from this theoretical perspective, the board's interests and the agent's interests are different. They're not aligned. And the practice of performance assessment helps boards account for principal interests and advance them and hold those agents accountable. So that's in theory, that's what the role of the board is from this perspective. Now, there are lots of different theories and roles, but this is the one that fits this dimension. Now, why is that difficult? So, and I just mentioned, it's a challenge. Do boards know who the principals are? Is everybody clear about that? That's a good question. Do boards know what they can't delegate and what they can delegate? And so a couple of months ago, we reviewed board roles and responsibilities, and legally boards can't delegate the evaluation function. They can delegate the implementation function, they can delegate other functions, but not the evaluation function. So this is an area of performance assessment that they can't give away. In terms of board and agent interests that are not aligned, CEOs have assumed greater power and control in not-for-profit organizations over the years, and they assume more power and responsibility. And so, and without that relationship, without a good relationship, the interests of principals are not well advanced. So this is a delicate dance here on this one. And the practice of performance assessment itself reduces risk to the organization, and it enhances the interests of principals and agents if it's done well. But boards lack that knowledge, that capacity, that those competencies to do it is one of the challenges. So the role then that the board plays is as fiduciary from this perspective. And the leadership role of the board really is on the stewardship of assets, ensuring that they're safeguarded, that the organization advances its mission, its purpose, it's compliant with the law, so it can't break the law, and it has enough resources to advance that direction. So fiduciary governance. So boards can get into trouble in this area. So there are more and less effective approaches to fiduciary governance. But let's just look at the role. The boards that do well tend to have board-centered CEOs. So their CEOs are actually helping them in this regard. They're very much being proactive, respecting the board's role in this regard, making it easier for them to carry out this role. So they don't do it in isolation. And boards may need to consult to fill those gaps in knowledge and fill those gaps in capacity, access external resources to do it, which is one of the reasons why we created Board Checkup. But there are consultants and other resources within the sort of industry that can be helpful. And the board needs to develop in this role. It needs to get educated about the nonprofit sector, about law and legislation. They're changing now more and more. These laws are being updated in terms of the industry at which it's situated and how it's different from other sectors of the economy. And then boards really knowing what it is that they need to measure and what's important in terms of its fiduciary role. And then making sure that money is presented around in the context of the mission or the priorities of the organization so that it can connect them. They're not separated. That's really difficult for directors to evaluate then. They're not connected. So performance-based budgeting and other practices can help a board meet its role here. And then what the board's risks are assessed are within the board's responsibilities. So Chait, Ryan, and Taylor wrote a really good book. I always I recommend people get it. It's called Governance as Leadership. And they review these 3 modes of governance, and they devote different chapters to them. And in the chapter on fiduciary, and they're all important. You can't have one without the other. The more, what they say, the more modes of governance a board practices, the more effective the board is, and the more leadership the board returns to the organization. But in each of these modes, you can have more or less, you could be engaged in it, but maybe not very effectively. So what they do is they sort of lay out sort of descriptively what effective governance looks like and what it doesn't look like. And so you could evaluate your board or other boards you are against these criteria. So a less effective approach to fiduciary governance would be a very formalized, rigid, structured view of it, where the focus just is internal and looking for problems and risks and linking them to legal duties and responsibilities as part of the due diligence role. So like a rigid view of fiduciary governance from that perspective. Meetings then would tend to be dominated by staff. CEOs would play dominant role, and boards are sort of passive in their responsibility here. And the questions that they ask tend to be focused on oversight. So this is just purely arm's length oversight, where management still plays this strong leadership role, and boards are just engaged to sort of look at basic questions around problems. Whereas a more effective approach would be what Chait, Ryan, and Taylor call an inquiry approach to fiduciary governance, where there's a lot more flexibility in structures, that the focus is internal and external, and it's not on detecting problems, it's on resolving or preventing problems. And so there's a culture developed that's much more collaborative, between the CEO and the board working together. Again, going back to earlier research, where the CEO actually supports and helps the board carry out this role, and really enhances the effectiveness of the board. Questions will shift. They won't be sort of binary yes or no questions. They will be questions that really are inquiry questions. I'm going to put up a slide in a minute again on what some of those look like. But a typical example would be, what's the business case for this? Or what did we learn from the audit? Not, did we get a clean audit? What did the auditor point out that we might need to improve upon? And so these kinds of questions suggest that the board is trying to learn and develop, and recognizes that problems are part of organizations, and that they need to work with management on them. And then the last question there about reflecting the needs of our community. So you'll see a lot of questions here that are focused externally. And when you observe boards in these, you really do hear these questions and observe these types of meetings. So here's again some of these inquiry type of questions. It depends on what the topic is. If it's about knowledge, if it's a knowledge-based question, then you're looking to learn something or understand something or find out how things are defined. If it's an applied question, which CEOs would often be involved in that implementation of policy, then these kinds of questions around application can be asked. And then all the evaluation questions really drive the data. They're really looking at evidence and making connections and synthesizing what happened so that they can account. So these are just examples of how important the questions are. So I'm going to just stop for more. Any questions before I sort of go on? Is this sort of making sense or following logically?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. It looks very good for using this question in our meetings.
Yeah. You could almost have a cheat sheet that you could give to directors to help them frame questions. And a great tool is Bloom's taxonomy of questions, and there's all different types, and they can be framed so they're appropriate for what you're trying to learn. And this could be an area for board development, and I think it would change board meetings a lot.
Yes.
Okay, so when we get clear then, so that those were clear, the theory and the concepts, and then the practices that I've just covered. And now talking about the board's role here, and these are sort of in performance assessment for thinking about the organization's effectiveness, its due diligence or role and fiduciary responsibilities around the organization, around the strategic plan. Are those objectives being met, or is there even a strategic plan? Because if there isn't plan, how do you actually evaluate that? So there could be gaps. There could be gaps here where it's not possible to come to some kind of conclusion about how the organization's purpose is being advanced if there's no strategic plan or there's no performance measurements. And if resources aren't aligned with those priorities. And then evaluating how the behavior is. Are people following the organizations, or acting within the values of the organization or the codes of conduct within that organization? How do you know that? How do you evaluate that? How are risks identified and managed? These are all part of evaluating the organization's effectiveness. I'm going to talk about frameworks that might help you, just like those questions a minute ago. That's a practical tool. I'm going to provide you with some practical guidance on how you could do this. So don't get overwhelmed by it, because there are frameworks and there are criteria that have been standardized that could be helpful to inform this with your board. So same with the CEO's effectiveness. You know, how do you know whether they're meeting your performance expectations? Is there a contract, an employment contract in place? What does that contract say that this individual is responsible for? And has that ever been evaluated? And has there ever been an appraisal process in place? And then, you know, is in terms of delegated authority, how is the board evaluating how well, like if it delegates the implementation of the strategic plan to the CEO, how is it assessing how well the CEO is doing implementing that? How does it do that? And then, and the leadership of that CEO as a leader of the organization, in the organization and externally. And then again, on the board's effectiveness, how does the board know, and this was a question for you talked about at the beginning, that it's governing effectively as a fiduciary and meeting its own accountability objectives in terms of how it could use data to improve itself. So I might skip ahead now to some frameworks because yeah, okay, I'm gonna talk about performance frameworks. So this is where, and I'm sure all of you have read the popular management literature and have probably heard about the balanced scorecard, and there's a balanced scorecard for charities and the social sector, and program logic models exist, and they all exist to align input, so resources, finance, human, with activities, outputs that you expect, and outcomes to evaluate programs. So these program logic models have been around as an antidote to the problem evaluation coming out of mainly around public sector evaluation of government programs. But they're often used in not-for-profits, especially those that deliver public goods and services on behalf of governments. And so they're really important in terms of organizing, providing an organizing framework of all of what a program does and how you would evaluate whether it was effective or not and had the impact that it needs to. Not-for-profits are different than government in the sense that they're more likely when studies have been done to focus on the outcomes rather than the outputs. And so often they'll know what changed in a community as a result of a program, but might not understand the performance of that program itself. So there may be some gaps there. The balanced scorecard is another framework that looks at the organization from different perspectives, and it measures performance from those different perspectives. So usually finance, internal, so internal around operations, often services, service quality, and then how well that organization learns and adapts to change. That's another type of framework. And then in not-for-profits, another one is a stakeholder scorecard, and that's used to monitor the performance and expectations that are linked to multiple stakeholders. And because they all might have different performance measures that they're interested in, and you'd have to manage those and those relationships and be able to account for them. So those are 3 types, but there's another one that I think is really useful. And it's called the competing values framework for organizational effectiveness. I'm going to show a illustration of it. What's interesting about this framework is that, I'm going to put it up right here, is that it measures effectiveness in different dimensions according to underlying values. So the human relations on the top left, the value there would be around human relations and pattern maintenance. So looking at engagement, morale, development of human resources, participatory processes. And many not-for-profits, each of these different dimensions will have different criteria of what makes the organization effective from that perspective. In not-for-profits, there tends to be a value based on human relations and engagement. And the values tend to dominate what gets measured, almost to a paradox of the opposite. So the opposite, in the opposite quadrant to human relations, is the rational goal quadrant, which places an emphasis on goals and efficiency, which is what boards are responsible for from this perspective. And so there's a paradox. And so it's not either or, it's and, that the board has criteria to be an effective organization. It must be effective in each of these dimensions. And there are different people place different value, oftentimes without talking about them. So on your board, for example, people may be driving certain strategies or certain criteria because they're important to them. And so they need to be discussed because they're all important. And there'll be tensions between them. So this framework actually explains those tensions and helps the organization understand and manage the paradox that emerges. So, for example, on the bottom left is all around accountability and efficiency and internal controls and data. And the paradox there is that then isn't focused externally on adapting and being open and flexible to change. So they're both important. You just have to be aware that you can't put all your eggs in one basket here, that they're all important. So So these are just examples of frameworks that can help you identify and talk about effectiveness criteria. And so I'm talking here as the organization as a whole. So I'm going to show you here. This is what this looks like if you look in the behaviors that you're going to see. And what's interesting is that what Rohrbaugh and Quinn say is you don't want to overemphasize or underemphasize any one quadrant. You want to be in the middle of all of them. And when you overemphasize one, you'll get into what they call the negative zones. So too much human relations could lead to permissiveness, and where you can't control that organization. Conversely, too much focus on goals may lead to exhaustion or lack of discernment of the direction of the organization if it's really, really driven by one direction or one vision, for example. So what you want to be is, you don't want to be Fry when you talked about the board not knowing or not engaging in its own assessment. That's an unclear, that falls in a negative zone because there's really nothing there. So you don't want to, you want to have enough, but not too much. So it needs to be balanced. Any of these approaches, again, going back to what I said, where you want to have an inquiry based, an open approach, a collaborative approach where you're working together to build strong accountability and assessment. That helps everybody. This is what that framework looks like from a leader perspective. You can use the same framework to evaluate leaders. Your CEO can be evaluated using this. Your directors can be evaluated from this perspective. And so it's a conceptual framework, a performance framework that can be used at multiple levels of analysis. If you have done the board checkup, we actually use it on our impact assessment for the board as a whole, decision-making effectiveness. And we assess the effectiveness of the decisions boards make using the same framework. So I want to then get into, I'm going to show you this man. Let me just introduce it a bit. So we've talked about theory, concepts, practice, recommended practice. Now I'm going to go into the research and show you what did boards actually change through performance assessment. And it's fascinating. And I actually just finished this analysis. I've got this is all the data that comes out of the board checkup. I just finished this analysis this morning. But by the board engaging in the performance assessment function, all of these changes resulted. Number one of all of them, assessment of the CEO's performance occurred most often. But there were changes everywhere. So through the practice by boards exercising their due diligence and their fiduciary role, there was greater clarity of their own governance role. There was greater clarity about their roles and responsibilities, their legal duties, about accounting and reporting, and the accountability role of the board itself. Assessment, performance assessment of the CEO, but the directors, the individual directors, chairs, boards, the organization, and a culture really developing around that. Regular check-ins on performance assessment, not one-time assessments, but discussions and openness to performance as being part of the board's role and governance. Strategic planning, there was a lot of changes there as well. around reviewing policies and procedures, having a dashboard that would allow the board to see where progress is being made on the implementation of the plan and meaningfully evaluating it, and connecting that plan to the CEO's performance appraisal. The board was more informed about the resources that it needed to advance its purpose, and develops and structured itself around this role. So it created and improved structures. It changed structures, like the executive committee now became much more engaging with the board as a whole. So the board as a whole could meet its due diligence role, making recommendations to the board. So that recognizing that the board is responsible for this, not just one committee. And if there is a committee or structures, that they bring those recommendations back to the board. Meetings changed from having more time for these discussions, more productive meetings, more informed decisions, opportunities for retreats, open conversation. Board composition needs change. So performance assessment actually helped the board identify who they needed to have on the board. And then again, going back to culture, there was a lot of culture change, which is one of the barriers to performance assessment that I talked about in the beginning. And culture does change through this. And so does the leadership of the on the board. So the CEO and chair became more collaborative. And in many cases, there was a new CEO that was hired. And the board working more as a team around this. So those are a lot of changes that happen through the board's focus on performance assessment. And you know, here's a word cloud of the words of those changes that boards described. We did this little analysis, and you can see the bigger the word, the more often that word was inputted into the assessment. So you can see assessment itself, change of the board, biggest changes were in the board's role and responsibilities. But then all of these there were lots of changes, as I mentioned. So, improving the board's role in performance assessment occurs, and that translates to the organization through the process of performance assessment. So this is a way to begin that process of getting more clarity of the board's role is through this practice. And this is not only supported by our research, but every empirical study has always pointed, of all the good governance practices, one of them has been associated with improvements in effectiveness and performance, and that's the practice of performance assessment. So it's a really good place to start. Whatever tool you use, it's useful. And that's really all I had.